Thank you. I am so thrilled to be here tonight. I'm glad to see that you're passing bottles of wine around. That's always a good sign when someone's going to speak. I'd like to thank Aaron and everyone at BSR for inviting me to be here today. I have spoken at a lot of venues over the last 7 years that would surprise the person I've become post Moms to Man Action, but this one wouldn't have, because I spent about 15 years in the corporate world. And I was a corporate communications executive. I'm thrilled now, though, to speak with you tonight as an activist. And I really hope that after we're done talking tonight, all of you will go back to your companies and your communities and figure out how you can be part of the movement to end gun violence. So for my story, about 7 years ago, it'll actually be 7 years next month in December, I was a stay-at-home mom of 5 in a place called Zionsville, Indiana, kind of minding my own business. I had decided to take a break from the corporate world to raise my family. And I was sitting at home when I was watching the news, and suddenly I saw that there was an active shooter in a place called Newtown, Connecticut, a place I had never heard of. And I can remember sort of looking up and saying, please, don't let this be as bad as it seems. And as we all know, 7 years later, it was beyond really what the human mind can fathom that 20 children and 6 educators would be slaughtered in the sanctity of an American elementary school. So I thought, okay, this is devastating, but it's also outrageous that I am seeing politicians and pundits telling me on my television that the solution to this crisis is more guns, that somehow 400 million guns in the hands of civilians is not enough to keep us safe. So I went online and I thought, okay, Mothers Against Drunk Driving was incredibly pivotal in my life as a teenager. I'm going to join whatever that is for gun safety. And I went online and it didn't exist. So I decided I would start my own Facebook page. And at the time, I had about 75 Facebook friends. So I'm not sure who I thought I was having a conversation with. But if you know type A women, you know that very soon they were Googling me and finding my email and my phone number. And they were reaching out to me and they were saying, I want to do this where I live. And that was the beginning of Moms to Man Action. And I should say that I was a white suburban mom who was called to action because I was afraid my kids weren't safe in their schools. Not realizing that over 100 Americans are shot and killed in this country every single day, including gun homicides and gun suicides in rural communities and city centers, and all of it matters and all of it has to be addressed. But for me, I realized that the same skills that had made me successful at Fortune 100 companies could also make me successful as an activist. That the management, the empathy, the organization, the negotiation skills I learned as both an executive and frankly as a mom could help me find this movement, to build this movement. So I want to share some quick lessons with you of things that I've learned over the last 7 years. I think you'll find them familiar in the corporate world. When you're building a movement, jump in. And I talk about this in my book, Fight Like a Mother, and Aaron mentioned that the proceeds go to gun violence prevention organizations, and it's really just a longer version of my speech tonight. But we have to build the plane as we fly it, especially women. I think that we're so just programmed to believe that we have to cross all the T's and dot all the I's before we can jump in. If I had waited until I knew everything there was about guns, gun violence, organizing, I never would have started Moms to Man Action, and the moment would have passed me by. The other thing is to trust the people that you choose to surround yourself with. The women that I started Moms to Man Action were perfect strangers across the country. I brought one very specific skill set to the table, and that was my ability to communicate. But all these amazing people brought their skill sets to the table, whether they were web designers or lawyers or organizers. And I reached out to them, I called them, and I said, please help me build this organization. And they did. The other piece of it that I learned is that branding is important. And I am so grateful to General Electric, where I cut my teeth on branding back in the 90s, because I chose this shirt which has really become a superhero to so many millions of people in this country. It helps women feel emboldened when they show up in state houses and in boardrooms. To a very vocal minority, it's a scarlet letter like Hester Prynne had. But for most people, this is the sign of a superhero, that they're willing to take on the most powerful special interest that has ever existed. The other lesson that I learned that was so important is that you're going to lose. But if you're going to lose, lose forward. Failure is feedback. You don't get involved really in anything, but especially in activism, without knowing that you're going to lose along the way. And I'll give you some examples of that. You know, when we started our organization, we first worked to pass something called Mansion to Me. It was a bill that would have closed the background check loophole that allows unlicensed gun sales without a background check in this country. Only 21 states have closed that loophole so far. And we fought hard to pass that bill. We spent months just assuming that this would happen, that surely our Congress would act after such a tragedy in this country. And I sat in the Senate gallery as several senators killed the bill. And I thought to myself, okay, we've done our best. We've worked our hardest. Maybe we'll just pack up and go home. And again, if you know anything about type A women, there is no going back. There's only going forward. And so what we began to do was to do this work in state houses and in boardrooms where we lived. And the boardrooms piece is what I'm really here to talk about tonight. I can remember I was watching television in June of 2013, and I saw that Starbucks was going to stop allowing cigarettes and even electronic cigarettes 20 feet outside their stores regardless of state law. And they had been allowing open carry inside their stores. Open carry is legal in 45 states in this country. It's almost totally unregulated, and it means that you can take a semi-automatic rifle or a handgun showing on your person into restaurants and retailers and other public places. So I called Starbucks and I said, I saw that you're going to change this policy to make your employees and customers safer. Will you also do the same around open carry? And they said they would continue to follow state laws as it pertained to guns. And so very quickly, this small group of Moms Demand Action volunteers, we were only 6 months old at the time. We couldn't even do an economic boycott. We did what I call a mom-cot. And using the hashtag Skip Starbucks Saturdays, we showed where we were having coffee on Saturdays instead of Starbucks. And we also made images of what open carry looked like inside Starbucks to go viral. And it really only took 3 months, and I'm sure some internal polling, that caused Howard Schultz to come out and say on television that guns were no longer welcome inside his stores. Not just open carry, but guns. And we realized that was an important lever of power that we had to pull as women and moms. We make about 80% of the spending decisions for our families. And so we were able to replicate that success very quickly at places like Panera and Target and Chipotle and almost a dozen others. And then in the intervening years, we continued to have these conversations and build relationships. And then after the tragic shootings this summer, companies like Walmart changed their open carry policy, and very quickly other companies followed suit as well. Companies like Kroger and Wegmans and other major retailers and grocers. The other lesson that I learned is that you have to build a big tent. You have to work across the aisle and cultivate relationships. We are a nonpartisan organization. We are data-driven, and we work through all aspects of our culture to create support for this issue. For example, we have a program called Be Smart. We are not opposed to the Second Amendment. Many of our volunteers are gun owners or they're married to gun owners. This is simply about restoring the responsibilities that go along with gun rights. And Be Smart is a program where we teach gun owners and non-gun owners alike, how do you responsibly store your guns? 4.6 million children in America live in homes with unsecured guns. We also have been able to convince Republicans and Democrats alike to work on this issue. In 2018, we were able to pass stronger gun laws in 20 states, and 9 of those were signed by Republican governors. And then, and finally, it is so important to make sure that part of your tent is the community you work, that you do, and that you are supporting communities that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence, and that you're reaching out to community leaders who are already doing this work. And we do that across the country through grant giving and through volunteer base. So all of these lessons essentially created the movement that we are today, a chapter in every single state of the country, nearly 6 million supporters, and we are taking on the gun lobby, and we are winning. And that is so important to remember, that often after a mass shooting tragedy, what you hear in this country is that nothing can be done, that nothing will ever be done. And I want you to know that we are, in fact, winning. In fact, we passed bills in 17 states last year, 38 laws strengthening gun safety across the country, and we defeated more than 270 gun lobby bills, giving us a 90% win rate for the 5th year in a row. And I think you know that many of the laws that we work on are based on data and research that we will know will save lives. For example, background checks. We have now passed background checks in 21 states in this country. A red flag law that allows families or police to remove the guns of someone who is a danger to themselves or someone else. We've passed those laws in 17 states, up from just 5 in 2018. And we've also passed laws that disarm domestic abusers. So over 50 women are shot and killed in this country every single month by a domestic abuser. We have passed laws in 28 states that make sure police officers can remove the guns of someone who is a convicted domestic abuser. So why am I here today? I'm here today because 58% of American adults have been impacted by gun violence. So that means that your customers and your employees have been impacted by this issue. It means they care deeply about this issue. And even if they haven't been impacted, I can tell you I don't go to a single event like this where I don't have a mom who comes up to me crying and says, I have just sent my kindergartner to school where they have to rehearse their deaths in the bathroom of their classroom. We are all impacted by this issue. We all care about this issue. And in your capacity as business leaders and employees, you have the power to influence change. I hope you saw that in September, over 145 business leaders signed a letter that was asking Senate lawmakers to finally pass background checks. It's a bill that is sitting on their desk, as well as a red flag law. After that letter was made public, now 220 CEOs have signed on to that letter. And that is because businesses can drive change that makes us all safer. And I mentioned that customers and employees want this. I will also tell you there is recent research from Edelman that shows that it is good for your company, that when you change your policies, you build goodwill among your constituents. And when your CEOs get involved, you build even more goodwill by being involved in this issue. And I want to talk about what you can specifically do. One thing I want to do is introduce you to Catherine Yontif. Catherine, where are you? There she is back there. So she is my colleague. She is the Director of Corporate Initiatives. So if you find her and get to know her, she will help guide you on working on this issue. The other thing you can do is to join our organization. And we are not just moms, we're not just women, we are now, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, mothers and others. So if you text the word READY to 64433, again, that's READY to 64433, we will get you involved immediately. You can vote for gun sense candidates. There is a website called gunsensevoter.org, and it will tell you all about your state and federal candidates and where they stand on this issue. Again, gunsensevoter.org. And then, just like we urge all of our volunteers to ask their companies, you too can vote with your wallet and make sure that you are giving your money to companies with gun sense. So, bottom line, what I want you to remember is that the NRA is beatable. Gun violence is not inevitable, and it is possible to win. We are winning, and this is an issue that your customers and your employees care deeply about. The culture is shifting, and this movement is finding new allies in this business world every day. I can remember back in 2014, we would have to drag companies into this issue kicking and screaming, and now they are coming to us and saying, how do we join your coalition? Please join us in fighting for a safe America for our families, we're winning. Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. And I'll ask people to take out your phones so you can text the number that Shannon referenced. And you can also tweet questions for this panel at the hashtag BSR19. We'll be taking those at the end. So a lot of the companies in the audience might be thinking, look, we don't make guns at my company. We don't sell guns at my company. This just isn't our issue. How would you tell companies like in that kind of position how gun safety is relevant for their businesses?
Well, as I mentioned during my talk, that 58% of American adults are impacted by this issue. Gun violence is so prevalent in our country. The fact that over 100 Americans are shot and killed every day, nearly 40,000 in this country every year. Whether it's gun suicide or gun homicide or even unintentional shootings, we are all impacted. And if you think back to marriage equality, it was something that companies didn't really want to get involved in. They considered it polarizing. And flash forward to 2019, and you can't really walk down, Madison Avenue without seeing people try to outdo themselves with rainbows. As the mom of a gay daughter, she doesn't realize that took years and years of effort and grassroots work. And so I really do believe that we are just a few election cycles away from the same kind of acceptance of gun violence being an issue where you can't not stay on the sidelines. You have to get off the sidelines. You have to be on the right side of the history. But I would also point everyone in the direction of the Edelman study I referenced as well, which shows that being on the right side of this issue is also good for your bottom line.
Yeah. Now, you've talked a lot about support for public policy change and how companies can activate around that, and we saw the enormous success and influence of the letter from Everytown. Beyond public policy, what can companies do? I think in some ways public policy is often one of the hardest areas for the leaders in the room to engage on. How can they create change in products and marketing and employee engagement? What are the other levers that people can pull?
I would say there's 4 major things that you could do. The first is to look at your policies that you have as a company. Do you allow open carry? Do you have policies that keep your customers and your employees safe from gun violence? Are you making sure that you aren't doing business with gun manufacturers who may not be on the up and up? Thinking through policy. I would say number 2 is to make sure that you are joining coalitions to fight for stronger legislation. We show up every single year in state houses and face the same bad bills again and again, and it's typically arming teachers, forcing guns onto college campuses, stand your ground, something called permitless carry, which is now passed in over a dozen states. And it is really often tough, especially in red states, to find companies that are willing to join our coalition to fight for stronger gun laws. And it makes a huge difference. Lawmakers often listen to business leaders. The third thing that I would say is to educate your employee base about this issue, allow them to do advocacy around it. I was recently invited to Levi's to speak at their community day, and I was like, I'm going to speak about guns, right? And they said, yes, that's what we want. So, that's definitely a shift. And then I would say the fourth thing is that to make this part of your CSR or your social impact programs, make sure that you're not just educating your employees, but also your customers and your communities.
I love that last point, too. Almost every company in here probably has an employee health and safety initiative, a human rights policy and approach. There are built-in ways already that gun safety and gun violence are part of a CSR agenda, yes. And I think that we can use that to drive change. Yes. So you've given some examples of what companies can do. I'd love to hear some examples of actual company action. I know you mentioned a couple. What are some other corporate examples that we can look to?
I talk about Walmart a lot as being such a good corporate actor on this issue, and it's been an evolution. Back in 2008, Walmart signed onto a pact that made their gun sales, they're really one of the most responsible gun dealers in this country. They, for example, videotape every gun sale. They don't sell to anyone who hasn't completed a background check, even though federal law allows them to. That was in 2008. Then after the Charleston mass shooting, they stopped selling semi-automatic rifles. Then after the Parkland shooting, they actually raised the age limit that you could buy a long gun. And most recently, as I mentioned, they've stopped allowing open carry, and they made many other changes as well. this is a process, and that's okay. I would look to other companies that are considering getting involved in this issue and looking at Walmart, looking at companies like Dick's or Salesforce or Levi's or Tom's Shoes, and to see that they have gotten involved in this issue very publicly, and it has only resulted in goodwill.
Yeah. Could you talk about the Salesforce example briefly?
Yes, so there's some companies like Salesforce who are actually not doing business now with companies that are manufacturing products that would be dangerous. So Salesforce specifically isn't working with companies that manufacture ghost guns or semi-automatic rifles. Citibank is another example that they've put best practices into place, and as well as Bank of America. They will now not lend to gun manufacturers who sell semi-automatic rifles to civilians.
Great. These are great examples and cross-sector examples that we can all draw from. So I'd like to talk about some of the myths that you hear. You probably hear a lot of misconceptions, and I want to get some of those out there and start to bust those myths. So the first myth to address is if a company takes action, there's going to be overwhelming backlash from pro-gun stakeholders. Let's talk about it.
There is a very vocal minority in this country that makes a lot of noise but goes away. And we have seen this time and time again. It's important to remember that 90% of Americans support stronger gun laws, 80% of gun owners, and only 1 in 10 of whom belong to the NRA, and 74% of NRA members even support stronger gun laws, and that is according to a Republican poll. So again, there's this very vocal minority that has essentially been writing our nation's gun laws and owning all the conversation around this issue. And when we see a company like Starbucks or like Walmart or like Dick's get involved, there may be some initial blowback, but because we have this grassroots army of Moms Demand Action volunteers and because America is on their side, what they ultimately experience is a shift of goodwill.
That's great. So another myth that I think we hear is, look, this is legal activity, this is legal commerce, we're a business, we're not in the position to regulate legal activity. How can companies take action on this, even though sales and carrying of weapons is legal?
Well, look, there is a patchwork of laws that exist in this country, and we are only as safe as the closest state with the weakest gun laws. Guns go over state lines as easily as cars do, and that's why it's so important that we have federal laws. And who do federal lawmakers listen to? It's often corporate leaders. I can remember when we put pressure on Chipotle to stop allowing open carry, and they did very quickly. The first question that was asked of then Governor of Texas, the first question he was asked during an interview was what he thought of this change at Chipotle. And so it just goes to show that it's all interrelated and that the campaigns that we do to ask companies to change their policies are also closely watched by lawmakers. And so it is all interrelated, whether you think that you are specifically dealing in this issue or not.
Yeah. I also think that a lot of companies in this room take action in ways that are not legally mandated all the time. They set supply chain expectations, they set product responsibility expectations outside of the law, and this is another place where they can do that. I loved your Starbucks example about that as well, about smoking. It's just one more step there. So another myth to address, companies often have partnerships and tie-ins with lots of different organizations. Sometimes that's with the NRA, and I think that when there's been publicity around those partnerships, some companies kind of say, look, we have these partnerships, we can't just pick and choose and cut off the NRA partnership because we don't like it. How can companies examine their partnerships, their tie-ins, and take action around that?
As you mentioned, I don't think it's any different than any of the other issues that companies are dealing with. If you have relationships with bad actors, that's usually something a company wants to make sure is not an issue or to stop those relationships. Look, the NRA is weaker than they've ever been in their existence, and the gun violence prevention movement is stronger than it's ever been. Our goal is to show lawmakers how toxic the NRA's agenda is, and they are under investigation on several fronts, whether it's their potential ties to Russia or their self-dealing. Their A rating has really become a scarlet letter. It is no longer a badge of honor. And that's our goal with lawmakers, but it should be the same with companies as well. This is an organization that has shown that it is not acting like a normal tax-exempt nonprofit. And I think any company would be wise to examine any relationship they had with the NRA.
Great. So one or two more questions, then we'll kick it open to the audience and to Twitter. But I wanted to ask, so you spoke a bit about what you've brought from your corporate role into your advocacy. I kind of want to ask about the reverse of that now. What do you wish you had known when you were in corporate communications that you now understand about the advocacy work that you do?
Well, first of all, you work a lot harder for free. You should know that. I was in crisis communications, and I always assumed I had to do what would give a company the most protection. And I thought that was to have the issue go away. And what I've learned now is that it's so much braver and bolder to be out front on some of these issues. And I also think it's to listen. When I worked in corporate America, we didn't really listen to our employees or our customers. We kind of did what was expedient or convenient or felt safest. And I think if you really listened, specifically on this issue, to both your customers and employees, what you would find is that there's overwhelming support to support this issue.
I love that point about listening and about different stakeholder constituencies. And you talk about this in your book about your own leadership of Moms Demand Action. Maybe you can speak a bit about how you've tried to reach out to different constituencies and different stakeholders and listen in different ways.
Yeah, we're not going to unelect everyone who opposes us. We're not going to unfriend or get rid of family members if they don't agree. And so you have to have conversations based on data and facts. And again, this is a big part of my book, which is dispelling these myths, because sometimes it's like Groundhog's Day that you have these same conversations with lawmakers over and over again. But to come to the table with data, with facts, instead of just emotion and anecdotes, I think is really important to enhancing any conversation on this issue. And that's, again, why the people in this room have such influence, because when you bring your data and your facts to lawmakers, it will make a huge difference, because it's a different set of data and facts than I would have as a civilian or an educator would have or a law enforcement officer would have. It's so important that lawmakers are hearing from the business community.
That's great. Terrific. Well, let's take some questions from Twitter and from the audience. I think we have some mics around. Mics, I see a mic. Mics. I see a question there.
Hi, I totally support what you're doing. I have a question, though. Sometimes things that we do have unintended consequences. So in states that allow, free carry of guns, when private businesses restrict the guns from coming into their places of business, and then the gun owners allegedly need to lock their guns in their cars, and leaving those weapons exposed to potential theft. How do we deal with that?
Well, unfortunately, the gun laws in this country are incredibly lax. Certainly, you could join a coalition as a business leader to make sure that people had to report lost and stolen firearms. That's a law that doesn't exist in many states in this country, and it's where most crime guns come from. But I don't think we can say we're just not going to act because it could, in turn, start a different chain of events. The reality is that we have to all get involved in strengthening the gun laws that we have. And that starts by sending a strong cultural signal that open carry, which is incredibly dangerous, but is also culturally reprehensible, that is not allowed in your own store and restaurant or retailer outlet or whatever it may be. We know that the gun lobby has worked very hard to force companies to allow guns in their parking lots. For just that reason, and they're continuing to creep up to the front door because the gun lobby's goal is to make people believe that guns are available to anyone, anywhere, anytime, no questions asked. And so just by putting that stake in the ground, which is something that you can do without having to pass a law, is incredibly important.
We'll pull a question from Twitter here. So just last year, a shooting occurred at the headquarters of a big tech company right here in Silicon Valley. What can companies do in Silicon Valley or elsewhere to protect and support employees who might be dealing with trauma from gun violence?
So there's a lot that can be done around trauma from gun violence, and we have a lot of programs. I think speaking with Catherine would be ideal, but we are in many ways a traumatized nation because of this gun violence crisis that we have. And so we work a lot with providing psychologists, for example, to give an hour of their time pro bono to this issue so that they can have discussions with civilians or employees. And so that may be something that companies could consider is if they put their toe in the water on this issue, and it goes back to this issue of listening, how many of your members of your company, how many employees have been impacted by this issue, and are they suffering from trauma, and what can you do as a company to address that? And Catherine would be a good go-to person.
Yeah. I think Catherine and I have even chatted about ideas like activating employee resource groups for people with an interest or with a personal relationship to gun violence to try to engage employees and activate them and help create those networks. Let's take another one from the audience. There's one right here. Can we get a mic? Oh.
Thank you. The work that you do is incredible, so thank you. I'm curious how you keep going. So I loved the lose forward message, but you have faced a lot of failure, and while you might have an awesome reception here, I'm sure you also have a lot of people who don't say such nice things. So how do you personally keep going?
Thank you. I appreciate that question. So keep going is, interestingly enough, our internal hashtag for how we stay motivated. We even have a shirt that says keep going. It's really about considering failure as feedback and realizing that this is not an issue that's going to go away. I think our organization feels strongly that if we lose our children, we have nothing left to lose. So we aren't going to be silenced. We aren't going to be intimidated. Women are only 17% of the 500,000 elected positions in this country. And as the proverb goes, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. And we are, again and again and again, especially on this issue. I mean, if you look at the Violence Against Women Act, the reason that hasn't been voted on in the Senate is because the NRA is scoring the bill. It includes a provision that would protect women from domestic abusers and gun violence. So we keep going because this issue is not going away. And I do think, again, it's like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It took them, we've been around now 7 years. I think it took them about a decade to get all the laws in place, and then they had to show up and protect the wins that they made. But I see a light at the end of the tunnel, and again, I think winning where we are winning, so I mean, again and again in state houses and boardrooms gives us all the motivation that we need to move forward.
To take one of the questions from Twitter and sort of expand it a bit, I think a lot of the people in this room are used to dealing with skeptics, people who, and maybe it's they're climate skeptics. Maybe it's just people who think that companies have no business engaging on sustainability topics. You probably encounter a lot of people who just flat out disagree with you. How do you engage with folks who are coming from such different mindsets? How do you persuade? Do you persuade? What's your approach to dealing with that conflict?
I think it's on many different levels. So first of all, there is a group, a very vocal minority of gun extremists in this country who believe any gun law whatsoever is a slippery slope to undoing the Second Amendment and confiscation. Those are not people that are going to be persuaded. But when you have 90% of Americans on your side, you don't really need to change their minds. You just need to get the silent majority, which is not so silent anymore. But you need to get them to vote on this issue. And that's really what we've been focused on. This is the top 3 issue and has been now in this country for the last couple of years at the voting polls. Recently, we won last week in Virginia. We outspent the NRA 8-1 in the state of Virginia, and we elected gun sense chambers to the House, both in the Senate and in the House for the General Assembly. And we know now that we can go back in and pass stronger gun laws in January because we have a governor there who will do the right thing. So this is really about turning out the vote, educating people, creating this huge coalition that shows the gun lobby, which again is waning in power, but has until now been the most powerful, wealthy special interest that has ever existed. It's showing them that they're out of time. And it takes everybody in this room to help us make that point. The issue becomes, if these people that disagree with you are friends and family, or if they're lawmakers who may change their minds, and we've seen that happen over and over again. 5 of the leading Republicans in the state of Ohio completely changed their minds on this issue after the mass shooting in Dayton. So I think it's just so important to come to those conversations with facts and data and research and not just emotion and anecdotes.
Great. Let's take one more from the room, and then we'll do one from Twitter. I see a question right there.
Hi. It's on. Hi, I work with an organization named Ashoka, and one of our Ashoka fellows works on this issue. She has helped us understand that there is a lack of a national database of all of the serial numbers of all of the guns in the country, and that is one of the biggest issues because you cannot track them, not the legal ones, not the illegal ones. Is there any news, any hope on that matter?
So that is a question about basically gun registration, which has not been something that lawmakers have been willing to discuss. You know, when we focus on what will make people safer, it certainly has to do with making sure the records that are already in the system are as robust and strong as they can be. The gun lobby fights to keep important records out of what we call the NICS database, which is how background checks are performed. So we go in and strengthen those laws. But when we look at what will keep Americans most safe, it's the 3 laws I mentioned before. So a background check on every single gun sale, and only 21 states currently require that. It's a strong red flag law. Only 17 states currently have that, and it's keeping guns away from domestic abusers. Most mass shootings in this country are in private residence, and they're started by an incident of domestic violence. And so the 28 states where we've disarmed domestic abusers is incredibly important, and we need to do that in the rest of the country. But most of all, we need to pass all of these laws at a federal level.
So let's close with a question from Twitter. If each individual in this room could do one thing when they get back to work on Monday morning to take action on gun safety.
Good catch.
I'm learning. What should that action be?
Well, I would say for the people in this room, call Catherine Yontif, all of you, on Monday, and start talking about how you, as your company, can get involved in this issue in one of the 4 ways I mentioned before. So whether that's educating employees, educating your communities, making this a part of your social impact programs, joining our legislative coalition, whatever that may be, we invite you to be part of this coalition and to just begin to work with us and to talk with us about how to address this issue. But I would also say no one can sit on the sidelines on this issue in this country. You just can't. Not when 100 Americans are shot and killed every single day. Time is of the essence. There is not a parent in this country who isn't afraid their child won't be the next victim of gun violence. And so I would encourage you to join our organization. We have a chapter in every single state. And again, you do that by texting the word READY to 64433.
And I know we have at least one chapter lead out here in the audience tonight, who's a BSR. There we go, right. Terrific. Shannon, thank you for sharing your story and your passion and your advocacy. I think that this perfectly illustrates what we're here to talk about this week, the ways that new forms of advocacy are changing the climate for business, and what companies can do, should do, must do to step up and take action to address some of these topics. I also think it's important to note that that goes internationally, right? This is not just a U.S. issue. Any company in the room that has operations, that has employees, that has supply chains, that has sales here in the U.S. Should be thinking about this issue. So I definitely encourage you all to find Catherine, find myself or a BSR colleague, and we can talk about ways to engage on gun safety. I encourage you to follow Shannon's Twitter, which is just phenomenal.
Thanks.
The output is extraordinary, and so is the quality. And I also encourage you to check out Shannon's book, Fight Like a Mother, and so many of the wonderful media hits that you do. I've been listening for the past week to a lot of your podcast interviews, and I learned something from each one.
Thank you.
So thank you all for joining for this kickoff here tonight. We are going to have dinner here at our tables, and then after that, we can go have a drink and network, and I'll connect at the reception. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy, and thank you to Shannon.
Thank you.